Welcome in, Agile Mentors. We're back for the Agile Mentors Podcast. I'm with you as always. I'm your cruise director on this bumpy voyage. I'm Brian Milner, and I am very excited for our guest today. There's oftentimes that we have guests on, I'm excited to have guests on, but I'm excited to have this guest and to talk about the topic we're going to talk about. So I have the OG, the legendary Ken Rubin is with me today. So welcome in, Ken.
Brian, thank you. It's always great to be in a conversation with you. I'm looking forward to it today.
Very, very excited. Ken, for those people, if you're newer, if you haven't been around for a while, Ken is, like I said, he's been around this Scrum thing since just the earliest days. I think I wrote down just from your bio that you were the first director of the Scrum Alliance. So you have been this since the very, very beginning. If you haven't heard of it or you don't know of it, Ken has a book out that is it's called Essential Scrum. It's number one in Amazon. It is just the word essential is great in that title because it is. It's essential reading. It is probably the foundational book I would say on Scrum that's out there. If you're looking, if you're new to this and saying, hey, I want to read more about this, there's something I want to pick up about it, that's the book I'd point you to. Ken's book is just really good foundation on it and goes through a lot of the stuff. So great book there. Ken's company is Involution. We'll talk a little bit about that. But the topic that we're going to talk about today is a topic that is near and dear to my heart and clearly to Ken's as well. But that's about dependencies. And dependencies in larger organizations, dependencies in scaling, and how those kind of manifest and the problems that they can cause. So maybe, Ken, we should start with defining that. When you talk about dependencies, what do you mean by dependencies?
Perfect place to start. Yeah, when we think about dependencies, what we're really talking about is a relationship between two or more entities that requires some degree of collaboration, or in this case, coordination, in order to ensure that the work gets done. And since I'm only really interested in dependencies between two or more entities, not within an entity, like here's our team. Hey, our team has to make sure we do task 4 before we do task 5.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong, important, but not really my focus. We as a team can handle that. It's when my team depends on your team that things get interesting. So think of a dependency as now between a requester and a servicer. So basically, I'm looking for the servicer to do what the requester has, in a sense, requested for them. So that's our essence. That's our starting point.
Awesome. That's a great description, and I completely agree. There's plenty of circumstances, and people come through classes all the time talking about how, hey, we've got this scenario where we've got to get this thing from another group in our organization. They supply it to us. They're in a different business area, or my favorite, the third party kind of dependencies, somebody who's outside the organization that supplies us with stuff that kind of creates dependencies. Are there different, how do you classify these? Do you have different classifications of dependencies? Do you think of them all kind of, external to a team, they're all kind of the same? How do you look at them?
So there is, at the highest level, there's really two types of dependencies I'm interested in. You can subdivide that into many different types. I'm dependent on a resource, I'm dependent on an individual, but I'll go more abstract than that.
Okay.
There are structural dependencies and there are instantiated dependencies. And I apologize for a little bit of the geek speak there. My background is in object-oriented technology. But if you think about it, structural dependency is a dependency between two entities that's sort of woven into the fabric of an organization. So for example, if my team always needs to go to the legal team in order for them to review legal language that has to go in the text box of our application, then I have a structural dependency on legal, meaning I have to do this. And so anytime I need legal review, I go to the legal team. An instantiated dependency is, if you're thinking of classes and instances, It's an instance across that structure. So now now I have to get approval for the text in the sign up screen.
Hmm.
So that creates an instantiation of that dependency. So now I have to be, if I went with a post-it note, I'd walk over to the legal team and I'd say, hey, legal team, could you please either craft or review the language that's going to go into the sign up screen? That's instantiated. The reason that distinction is important is that most approaches to dealing with dependencies deals with instantiated dependencies.
Hmm.
And that misses the entire point.
Yeah.
Think of it this way. If I could eliminate the structural dependencies, I eliminate all future instantiated dependencies. If I get rid of the class, I don't have any instances anymore of it. So if you think about it, if I found a way to not have to go to the legal team to get that review, obvious approach, put a lawyer on my team.
Yeah.
Then I broke the structural dependency and I would no longer have any instantiated dependencies. So to me, if you really want to solve your dependency problem, you go after the structural dependencies, not the instantiated ones.
That's a really, really key thing. I hope people pick up on that, because you're absolutely right. We often deal, I mean, the way you talk about that to me is it seems like, we're dealing with the symptom, not the root cause. If we're
Yes.
dealing with the instance of a dependency, we might solve that instance and try to mitigate what problems might come from that instance, but we haven't really addressed the root cause of what caused it. If I'm building a house and I'm running the pipes for the water, and it has to go through 3 other locations before it gets to my shower, it's going to take a while for hot water to get to the shower because it has those dependencies of where it's going to flow through. Whereas if I have a straight line to the hot water heater, I'm really stretching a metaphor here, but if I have a straight line to the hot water heater, then it's fairly instant. It comes on, without any delay. And that's essentially what we see inside organizations is there's these built-in, like you said, structural, right? If I need to go outside my team to get a legal person's opinion, that team is not, every time something comes up, they're not creating an issue that causes a dependency. You've built in the fact that they are going to have that dependency, and there's nothing they can do if that's the structure, right?
And yes, and I think that use of the term built in is critical there. Organizations have either intentionally or just over time organically evolved to the point where they have these, and they tend to have a lot of them. And it seems so much more natural for them to go after the instances, because this is where terminology gets confusing.
Yeah.
In the industry, you often hear people talk about blockers.
Yeah.
And they'll use the term dependency and blocker interchangeably, but they're not the same thing. I mean, if you think about it, all dependencies have the potential to become a blocker.
Yeah.
But a dependency only becomes a blocker is if the instantiation of it impedes the flow of the work, because that's really the essence of why dependencies are bad. They can impede the flow of work. So not all dependencies become blockers. So by example, my team's dependent on your team to do some work.
Yeah.
You promised it would be done by next Monday. So I think we would all agree I have a dependency on your team. Now, if your team delivers what you said you were going to deliver next Monday, I didn't get blocked. So I had a dependency, but it wasn't a blocker.
Right.
On the other hand, if your team fails to deliver what you promised next Monday and the flow of my work is now impeded, that dependency has moved into a blocked state.
Yeah.
So the industry's been very focused on blockers and how do I avoid dealing with blockers? And my attitude is simple. The easiest dependency to deal with is the one you don't have.
Yeah.
So your goal is to eliminate them. You're not trying to make nice with your dependencies and figure out, well, when they move into a block state, what should I do about it? How about you don't get into a block state to begin with? And then your flow, which is everything should always be about flow. How do you keep the flow moving? Dependencies are probably the biggest inhibitor to flow. The more you have, the more you'll get blocked.
Yeah.
So reduce your dependencies. And how do you do that? Not by going after instantiated dependencies. You go after the structural dependencies. That's the essence of this.
Yeah, huge point. By the way, just I'm going to interject this a couple times in our conversation, but Ken actually has put together a 1 day class on this. One of the reasons we wanted to have him on was to kind of raise the visibility of that and let people know that this is coming out. So it's a great opportunity if you are, a Scrum Master or you are even product owners and you're dealing with dependencies. This class is a great class for you. It's called Dependencies Are Killing Your Agility. It's going to be on March 14th. It's right now. It's a one-time kind of class. It's March 14th. It's 10 to 4 Eastern time. There's some pre-work kind of stuff to do there. You get bonus video kind of content from Ken as well. But Ken really shares a lot of his wisdom in working with some large organizations as far as this is concerned. So I love where we're going with this, and I want to talk more about that concept of flow, because I know, especially if people are newer to this and don't really understand what we mean by flow, why would we care about this concept of flow? What does flow mean?
Yeah, so at its essence, flow is the movement of materials, or in our case, usually work, across the collection of people that have to get the job done in order to do it in a timely fashion. Right. So think of it as a constant flow of value to our customers. And so anything that impedes our ability to do that, either it takes more time, right? And time, as we all know, is money, right? Because there's a cost of delay associated with not being able to deliver what we need to our customers. So most organizations start to focus in a lot of areas, but what they don't focus on is flow. And I'll give you the obvious example. Most larger organizations are all about utilization. That's their focus. How do I keep my people busy? Because everybody knows idle hands are evil hands. So you got to be pounding on those keyboards, getting stuff done. That completely misses the point. That keeping my people busy doesn't guarantee much of anything. What I'm interested in is keeping the work flowing, not how busy I keep my people. So if said it another way, the economic damage in our world is not caused by idle people, not caused by the idle worker. It's caused by the idle work.
Yeah.
So we want to keep the work flowing, and dependencies are the biggest inhibitor to flow. So if your ultimate goal is keep the work flowing so that we deliver a constant stream of value, and then you step back and you say, well, what's preventing me from having good flow? It's almost certainly going to be dependencies. So if you're not addressing that problem, it's hard to imagine how you'll get interesting flow characteristics.
Yeah. Yeah. This leaders who are out there listening, this is a huge point, because I know that there's lots of managers out there who have come up through the system and kind of feel like my job as a manager is to really work with the individuals to kind of wring them like a towel and get the most out of that person that I could get out of that person. When what Ken's saying, and I completely agree, it's not to say that that may not make any difference, but it's such a fractional difference compared to something like flow, and the difference that you can get from something like flow. One of my favorite examples I've always heard about flow that just drove it home to me was the idea of a freeway, an expressway. We all know at rush hour, you think about using something to capacity. Well, at rush hour, a freeway is used to capacity, right? Every lane is full. Every square space is blocked with a car who's taking up space. So capacity wise, fully using capacity, right? Flow wise, nothing's moving, right? Nothing is actually going through. It's because there's too much volume. So there's actually times when you can actually decrease your flow by trying to push and force too much volume through the system that you have in place. And that's kind of one example of that. Yeah.
So in fact, that's really, that is a very important point, because if you think about the strategies that you might employ to get on top of this problem of structural dependencies, one of them is to manage system level WIP. WIP being work in process. Think of work in process as the cars on the freeway that Brian just mentioned, right? So, this idea that if you're working on too many things at the same time, not only do you have the issue, you're going to slow everything down, right? By the analogy, right? You're working on all these different products or projects, and none of them is going particularly fast because you're wasting so much time multitasking. But the problem with that is it introduces more and more dependencies, more WIP, more things that you're working on, introduces more instantiated dependencies into the environment. So now the problem is compounding itself. So one of the core strategies is you need to balance your system level WIP with your capacity to do work. Meaning don't work on more things than you have the ability to do, would be the simple way of stating that. And that one strategy alone makes all problems simpler. It doesn't eliminate them, but it simplifies them. And since you're never going to eliminate all your dependencies, that's a pipe dream. It's not going to happen, not at any interesting scale. So your goal shouldn't be eliminate them all. It should be minimize. Right? Because you won't get rid of, and if you try to get rid of all of them, you'll probably end up performing unnatural acts. Right? So you probably don't want to do that. So yes, the whole WIP analogy directly applies here.
Yeah, I love that, and you're right. If there's an opportunity, right? I mean, you used an example before about a legal person. Let's say we have a legal department and we need legal sign off on something that's going to be in our team that we're putting out. But I can hear people listening, shouting out over the ether saying, "Yeah, but I only need that legal advice once every 5 sprints. So I don't want to waste that person sitting on a team for 5 sprints for only what they need one every 5 sprints."
Right. So now we're into solving the problem. This is good. We have a structural dependency on legal. So what are our options? Option one. So the one that everybody's going to think of, and that there's the myth that feature teams solve everything. If we just created 100% feature teams, we'd have no dependency problems anymore. Unfortunately, that's a myth. It's not true. Yes, feature teams help. And by the way, the reason why everybody talks about feature teams is they do actually give you your largest return on investment, right? For being able to reduce dependencies. And I should state one other thing, because it will help in understanding this. The problem with dependencies is they don't grow linearly. The problem grows exponentially. Think of it this way. If I have a piece of work and I put it on a Post-it note, and I give the entire Post-it note to one team, I hope we would agree that, let's say they're doing a sprint. At the end of the sprint, there's only 2 possible outcomes. They got it done, or they didn't get it done. Those are the only 2 possible permutations. Sorry, everybody, we're going to do just a tad of permutational math. Now, imagine I had a front-end team and a back-end team. So I have this, this Post-it note that represents the feature that a customer wants, but I can't give the whole Post-it note to one team. So, you'll hear this on the podcast. I tear the Post-it note in half. And I give one piece to the front-end team, and I give the other piece to the back-end team. And I say, please get that done. If you do the math with me, what you'll realize very quickly is there's now 4 possible outcomes, only one of which is favorable. The outcome of the front-end team got it done, the back-end team got it done. Yay, success. But there's 3 other permutations there. The front-end team got it done, the back-end team didn't. When they said they would, or the back end team got it done and the front end team didn't, or sadly, neither of them got it done. Now imagine, just for the sake of illustrating this, I tore the Post-it note one more time. Because now I have a front end team, a middleware team, and a back end team. Now I have 8 possible outcomes, only again, one of which is favorable. All 3 teams got done what they said they would get done when they said they would get it done. So if you're mathematically inclined, you've already figured it out. The likelihood of being successful is 1 over 2 to the n power, where n is the number of pieces of Post-it note. One piece of Post-it note, 1 over 2 to the first power, 1/2, 50% chance. So every time I add a dependency, I don't make the problem one dependency more difficult. I double dependency, I double it again. Or if you're an optimist, a glass half full kind of person, every time I can eliminate a dependency, I make the problem twice as easy.
Yeah.
So why are feature teams the biggest return on investment? Well, if I had a front end, middleware, back end team, and I had to tear every post-it note into 3 pieces so they each could get their little piece in their backlog, N is 3.
Hmm.
If I decided to create a feature team and I moved a front end person, middleware, and back end person onto the same team, I wouldn't have to tear the post-it note up into anything. I would just give the entire post-it note to the feature team and say, please get this done. N is 1. We reduced N by 2,
Yeah.
which means we made the problem 4 times easier.
Hmm.
Which is why, most people may not know the math behind why feature teams are so compelling, but intuitively they know they are.
Yeah.
And they're right. So the myth isn't that feature teams are good. They are good. The myth is that if I created only feature teams, I would solve my dependency problem. That's the myth, because at large scale, you can't do it.
Yeah.
For any number of reasons I'm happy to go into, you can't do it. So creating feature teams is one of the strategies that you would use when trying to deal with structural dependencies. It won't be the only.
Okay. That makes sense. I mean, I we used the example before of a legal person who's only needed once every 5 sprints. I can see that can be one of the examples. You could have, I've heard people say, we have a need for quality to keep this group of people on, this skill set on one group together.
Yep.
So we have a component kind of team for that reason. There are reasons to do that. External people, right? We've talked about that a little bit. So I absolutely agree. You cannot eliminate them entirely. I think Scrum would say, hey, in general, it's going to be better to have the feature team. You're going to, for the reasons you just listed. But there's going to be times when you can't really get rid of that. So as long as it's not accidental, right? That's the big thing. I don't want to have an accidental component team. But if it's deliberate and I have a solid reason for it, what are some things I can do when that can't be eliminated?
Okay, so we have not yet fully addressed the really, really good point you brought up, which was, hey, wait a minute, I don't need a full-time legal person on the team. Because the first pushback you'll get at scale when trying to create feature teams is, I don't have enough of them. I don't have enough lawyers. Every feature team can't have its own lawyer because we don't have enough lawyers in the company. And every team does not need a lawyer 100% of the time.
Right.
So let us now introduce the concept of the threshold. Okay, so there is a threshold value. I don't know what it is in any particular company, but let's agree that if I need a lawyer 100% of the time, then you should put a lawyer on my team.
Yep.
Because I doubt anybody's going to disagree with that. All right, but let's test it now. 90%. Are you going to assign me a lawyer at 90%? Remember, our goal is not to keep people 100% utilized. We stated that earlier. So are you okay if I put a lawyer that's only needed 90% of the time on a team? You might go, sure.
Yeah.
Fine. 80%? 70? 60? You tell me. When did I cross the threshold? Yeah. So there is a threshold value in every company. Let's go to an obvious one. I only need the lawyer 40% of the time. You're like, well, I'm not going to give you a full-time lawyer then. Okay, so, and that's fair, right? Because the economics won't favor doing that. Right. You don't have enough of them anyway. You're not going to bury one on a feature team when they only need them 40% of the time. Yeah. So what are your options? The good news is you have options. Now, this is where the hybrid model, by the way, I need to state this. From this point forward, there are only compromises.
Okay.
There is no perfect solution, right? So if people are listening right now going, okay, he's going to unveil the perfect solution. There's no such thing. There's only compromises from this point forward. And what you have to decide is which compromises you're prepared to make and which ones you're not prepared to make. So let's say we have a hybrid model. So for the sake of our legal team, rather than calling it a component team, which it technically is, we'll call it a shared services team.
Yeah.
And in this discussion, services team is semantically identical to a component team. Okay. Another example of a shared services team is I put all my UI designers on one team.
Yeah.
So anytime somebody needs a UI design, you got to tear that little piece off your Post-it note and you got to go over to the UI team and you got to put it in their backlog. And now you're in queue and you're waiting for them to to get to your work, and they could block you.
Yeah.
Right? Because you could wait 6 weeks because you weren't the only one asking the UI team to do a UI design, and you may not be what they consider their highest priority. All right. So, but let's say we keep the shared services team. All right. So let's also agree that any team that's above the threshold gets the resource embedded into their team, because we just said that was an obvious thing we'd want to do.
Yeah.
But for those teams that don't have that threshold level need or beyond, well, they're going to have to go get into the shared services queue.
Yeah.
Right. So you're going to have to get in there and do it. So you sort of have this combined feature and component team model where we leverage feature teams at that level. We're like, yeah, that made sense to do that. And everybody would agree. And then if you're like, yeah, I'm not going to put the lawyer on that team full time, then those teams have to get in queue and they have to use it. Yeah. And you also have one other option, which would be called systemic swarming.
Okay.
Swarming is, the idea that, hey, we all sort of swarm onto the problem. Well, what I could do is think of it as a systemic rotation, if you'd like. What if feature team A needs a lawyer for the first 3 sprints, heavy legal work, first 3 sprints, but then light legal work after that? You might choose to rotate the lawyer onto that feature team for the first 3 sprints.
Yeah.
And then what do? I rotate them back into the shared services team after the first 3 sprints. Oh, wait a minute. Doesn't that violate the rule of long-lived teams that we try to strive for? Yep. As I said, no perfect solution, only compromises. And you might go, I'm willing to make that compromise. Yeah. Right, by rotating the lawyer on and off. So there are a number of different patterns we can use. The point is, at scale, in any organization of interest, where you have all these shared dependencies, your first goal is to break them as much as you can, minimize.
Yeah.
And when you can't, you start applying these patterns to lessen the issues, right? And you will have to deal with instantiated dependencies, because you're going to have some. They're not all going away. And you will have to deal with blockers. I'm not saying the people who focus on blockers aren't adding value. They are.
Right.
But I'm trying to prevent things from becoming blockers in the first place. They're trying to deal with what are you going to do once they become a blocker?
Right.
Like avoid the problem would be my first strategy. So.
Yeah, no, that's a great point to make. And that leads me to thinking about, in kind of scaled environments, there's a big difference between identifying a dependency prior to it becoming a dependency, or prior to the need for that dependency, and identifying the dependency at the moment that it's needed. In my kind of estimation, there's a lot less options if you identify it in a moment of need than there is if you can look ahead and say, hey, we got this thing that's coming up in a couple of sprints that we're going to need something.
Well, let's play that out. So I think most people are familiar with like a program board. Yeah. Most scaling approaches have something. I mean, Safe made it very popular, right, to have one of those. And so that's a good example of one of the myths. There's a bunch of myths that come with managing dependencies. One is that one solution works for all size dependency problems. Clearly not true. Yeah. Right. I mean, so program board in the small, useful tool for a small number of instantiated dependencies. Because let's agree that a program board only shows you instantiated dependencies. Right. The cards that you put up is like, to do this piece of work, this other piece of work has to happen by this other team 2 sprints before me. Right. And if you're doing your red string across the board and you only have a small number of them, completely going to work as a tool for visualizing those instantiated dependencies, helping you understand how to coordinate them. But that's unfortunately not what most teams program, or most organizations program board looks like. It's got cards everywhere and string going everywhere. So here's a good example of the myth. A tool that works well in the small doesn't work in the large. So if you have that problem, then that tool's not going to work. And it didn't even address the root problem anyway, which was structural dependencies. That's a tool for visualizing instantiated dependencies. And if you have a lot of them, it's not a very effective tool for doing that. Just because I can draw the picture doesn't mean I can manage it. Yeah. So there's a lot in there.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely. I do want to give something to the people who, because I know there's lots of people out there who are on teams that, for decisions that are, I typically use the word constraint. They're under a constraint that a structural kind of dependency that the organization has imposed on them.
Mm-hmm.
They can't make a difference. They can't eliminate that. The organization has said, no, this is what you must deal with. So a great example would be you have to work with this third party
Mm-hmm.
who's providing something to the team. If I'm on one of those teams, what are some strategies? What are some things I can do to minimize kind of the impact of that dependency that I have with a third party?
Awesome. Okay, so any Scrum person knows of the concept of basically a working agreement.
Yeah.
But a working agreement, as is typically used, right, in Scrum, is like an intra-team working agreement. It's like, hey, how do we as team members agree to work with one another? What are our rules of engagement, our collaboration? Working agreement. What if we expanded the concept to be an inter-team working agreement? So an inter-team working agreement basically says, I know I'm not going to be able to eliminate all structural dependencies.
Yeah.
I'm going to have a dependency. I'm going to have the dependency on the legal team. I'm not getting a lawyer. They're not putting one on my team, right? I'm going to have to tear off the legal piece of every piece of Post-it note. I'm going to have to go over to the legal team. I have to drop it in. So maybe what I do is I predefine the coordination with the legal team, AKA inter-team working agreement.
Yeah.
So we basically agree on what are the rules for how we will coordinate on an instantiated dependency when it comes into existence, because it will come into existence, because I can't avoid it because I didn't get my lawyer. So I'm going to have to tear out those pieces. I have to put it into your queue. So you really want to do sort of these inter-team working agreements, and there's a lot you can put in there.
Yeah.
Right. In terms of, the different things, like I like in my working agreements, it could be like, what's the scope of the services your team, like I'm the requester, you're the servicer. So what services are you providing to me? What's the intake process? How do I give you work?
Yeah.
Do I put it in like Jira? Do I get to drop it in your backlog in Jira or some other tool? Do I call you up? Do I send you an email? How do you ingest, sort of all this work? Do you get to say no?
Yeah.
Can I say, I want you to do this? Do you have the right to say no? Can the legal team go, we're not going to do that?
Yeah.
Or do they always have to do it? How do we interact? So if you have questions, hey, I'm not really sure what you're asking me to do. How do we do that? Do we have a service level agreement? Legal, if I put this in your queue, are you offering me an SLA? This is what Kanban would do. Like in an 85% probability, we will be able to review the text for your sign-on screen within 5 days.
Yeah.
We're guaranteeing you 5 days. So I know that I can plan around that, right? I have an agreement with the legal team that I have a 5-day SLA with an 85% probability. So now I can structure to try to avoid blockers.
Yeah.
I don't want to get blocked by these guys, right? And what are the metrics on deliverables? You go on and on. And I'm not saying you should overdo it. And I get it. Some people are going to go, wait a minute, you just violated the Agile Manifesto. Your contracts over, basically collaboration. This feels like you want a contract with another team. No, I want a working agreement with them. And by the way, I get it. Some people will be unhappy with, I shouldn't have to ask them for that. Like, then don't. And it may work out just fine.
Right.
But you may find that, think of a working agreement as a pre-definition of how we will coordinate on this, and do that with external vendors, because external dependencies, the worst.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
The worst, right?
Yeah.
If it's internal, most people, by the way, one of the other myths about dependencies, I can always solve the problem via escalation.
Right. Yeah.
Escalate it to someone high. And by the way, you're likely to get some mileage out of doing that. Unfortunately, on an external dependency, they're not in your organization.
Yeah.
And you might have a contract with them that you could use to hold over their head. But at the end of the day, you can't go to someone, you can't go to your vice president or the vice president above her and, whatever, and say, take care of this. They may have no ability.
Yeah.
Be careful of your external dependencies.
Yeah, and I think that's a good kind of piece of advice is to not let these become very strict contracts that are we're start to become the Scrum police and enforcing things in that manner. But I know I've been on teams that have had constraints with other dependencies outside the team, and we've had agreements before to say things like we're not going to. We can't start a sprint with a dependency that has not already been fulfilled, because we're promising, right? We're committing to that we are going to finish this work in the sprint. So how can we be committed if there's something outside of our control that could actually affect whether we finish it or not? Now I know there's people probably feel a little differently about that, and some might think, well, that's not very much of a collaboration if you're not really, partnering with the other person. I get that, but for the teams I was working on at the time, it was what was needed because the third parties were causing us to be delayed. We were trying to raise the visibility of the fact that this is where the source of the delay is, and that working agreement helped.
Well, you actually, in my opinion, you hit on the key word there. Here's another myth about dependencies.
Yeah.
I know what all my dependencies are, so I've pretty much solved the problem. I've identified them, therefore I've solved it. And just because you can draw me a dependency picture doesn't mean you have solved the problem. The biggest problem with dependencies is when. Yeah. Right? It's not that look, it's not magic that I know that my team is dependent on your team to deliver something next Monday. It's not like I didn't know that. I knew that. What I don't know is when you're actually going to deliver. And the problem with that is I don't control it because you have your own product owner, right? And and even though I put my work into your queue, I wasn't the only one putting work into your queue. Right. There were other teams that were putting work in your queue. And even though I'm positive my work is the most important thing you should be doing, your product owner may not see it that way. Yeah. And so at scale, imagine this is happening all over the place. Let's say I tore that Post-it note into 5 pieces. Yeah. And I put it into 5 different backlogs. Think of what has to happen for me to get what I need when it was promised. All 5 teams have to do all the necessary work on their little piece of Post-it note while simultaneously coordinating with all the other teams, get all that work done, fully integrated back together, end-to-end tested in a way that at the end of the sprint, I have my Post-it note back. Yeah. That's a 1 out of 2 to the 5th power, 1 out of 32 chance that that's going to happen. Yeah. And if I was a betting man and I was in Vegas, I'd bet against you every time. Yeah. On your ability to do that. So when you get to a large number of dependencies like that, the when is what kills you. I can't guarantee when something's going to happen because I don't control it. Yeah. Which is why at scale, you need something called a coordinated ecosystem. Right? You need all the teams that are going to be working on something large under the auspices eventually of one individual, one product owner. And that one product owner can control the when at the highest level. Because that product owner can say, this is my highest priority. I need all teams to align on getting that done. Yeah. Is that going to work 100% of the time? Probably not. Right. But it's a whole lot better than relying on 5 different product owners, each with their own priorities, all trying to somehow do the right thing at the right time. It's not going to happen. Yeah. You're going to get blocked. That's why work is in a block state 90% of the time or more. Yeah. At scale. And that's like a mathematical fact for most companies. Their work is sitting idle 90% of the time because it's in a block state. Wow.
That's so amazing that when you kind of think about the ramifications of that, just let that sink in 90% of the time, another way kind of to think about this is if you ordered a t-shirt from a mom and pop, online t-shirt place, right? You fill out the credit card information, you process it through. What happens immediately after that? Well, it waits, right? There's an order that's waiting for something. And that's what we're talking about is that time where it's sitting there doing nothing. No one's working on it. No one's doing anything on it until somebody picks it up and then says, oh, someone wants this order. Let me go to the warehouse. I'll find the item. There may be,
Yeah.
5 different steps in there. I found the item. Here it's in the slot. All right. Someone else then comes and picks it up from the slot, packages it, put it in a box. Someone else has to put the label on it. Someone else has to then take it to the shipping location. All that time that it's waiting in between for someone to pick it up and do something, that's that waste time that Ken's talking about here, that 90% that happens in a lot of our workflows.
Yeah. And now imagine that, it would take 10 days for you to receive your shirt.
Yeah.
What we just said was 9 out of that 10 days, nothing's happening.
Yeah.
Nothing is actually happening. And it's baffling that people won't focus on trying to solve that problem. That's the flow problem we were talking about before. And so you really want to have this coordinated ecosystem, and woe to that poor product owner that had, I'll give you, this is a real example.
Yeah.
I was working with a company for multiple years where we were trying to get hundreds of teams to all collaborate at scale. And one of these poor product owners in a shared services team had 85 stakeholders that could drop stuff into her product backlog. How in the world do you prioritize the competing requests of 85 stakeholders who, by the way, organizationally are 2 to 3 levels above you?
Wow.
And they're all screaming in your face at the same time that theirs is the highest priority. How in the world are you going to do that job? And by the way, one product owner out of many who's trying to do this, and they all have to coordinate and all have to guarantee that they do what they said they would do when they said they would do it, so that I get my full Post-it note back together and ready to deliver. It's not going to happen. Yeah. This is why most organizations at scale are suffering. So when people talk about scaling Agile, in my opinion, they're missing the biggest part of what scaling is about. And if they don't address this problem, it doesn't matter almost anything else they do. It won't matter. Yeah. I mean, imagine 90% of your time you spent idle.
Yeah.
So, all right, Brian, I'm going to hire you. I'm going to be the executive company. I'm going to hire Brian. And I say this to Brian. Brian, I hope when you're done working with my Scrum teams, they'll be like 10% more effective at using Scrum. Meaning I'm kind of asking Brian for a 10% velocity improvement of my teams. Now, you know that Brian's going to say something like this. Really? That's the problem you want help solving? Let's do the math here. Yeah. Let's see, 90% of the time your work is idle. 10% of the time your teams do value-adding work. So if I helped you squeeze a 10% improvement out of the 10% of the time your teams are doing work, you would see an overall improvement of 1 lousy percent. If I helped you figure out how to squeeze 10% of the waste out of how your work is flowing, you'd immediately get a 9% return. We're watching the wrong thing. Yeah. Right. So again, it's back to that. Companies are focused on keeping people busy, and they're not worried about how to keep the work flowing. And you could make your Scrum teams 10% better. Really could do that, and it would have almost a negligible impact on the overall result.
This is so good. This is so good. If this is resonating with you, as I said, if this is something that, like Ken said, right? If there's 90% of the time that most organizations or most teams are idle based on just gaps in their flow, right? And how things are not actually flowing well, caused by a lot of these dependencies, then this could be honestly one of the most impactful classes you could take. So just another kind of plug here for this, this class that Ken is teaching, Dependencies Are Killing Your Agility, March 14th. It's from 10 to 4 Eastern time. We're going to put links in our show notes for this. But Ken, you want to give a shout out for just a quick URL where people can go to find out more information about the class?
Absolutely. You can go to learn.inolution.com. That's the website for it, and you'll see it right there.
Perfect. Like I said, we'll have these links in the show notes. Ken also did a really good kind of guest blog post for us about this same topic, because it was just such good information that we wanted to get some more information from him on it. So I'll link to that in the show notes as well if you want to read out more about this. But Ken, thank you so much for coming on. This has been such a deep topic, and I really appreciate you sharing your wisdom and time with us.
Brian, thanks for having me here. I really enjoyed it.